This is Pat McCarthy. I made a video about bearings now. I would recommend, there's plenty of good information out there on bearings. Get yourself a bearing book, Cleveland, King, whatever you want to read, and read up on it. I covered some of it in the bearing situation on this Pontiac, but I didn't cover all of it. And I believe if you listen to my video, you'll find out that I made a mistake. I said bimetal, and I meant trimetal. P bearings are trimetal. Some of the Kings and the ACLs, I think ACLs got what they call Duraglide, special formula Babbitt. Everybody's got their own little thing, but generally, what I wanted to say was trimetal when I said bimetal. And P bearings are tri-metal. And generally, they work quite well. So that's all I wanted to say before you watch this video. I didn't cover everything. There's some things I left out. I didn't get into oil pressure bypass springs, and I didn't get into any of that, or size oil pumps, or whether you use a 3/4 pickup on a small block and use that pump, or use the 5/8 earlier style pump. I didn't get into any of that. I might get into some of that later on. I'm just trying to get somebody that doesn't know much and wants to watch the videos to at least get them so they kind of understand some of it. I'm not trying to say I covered everything. There might be some things you disagree about. That's okay. That's fine. That's the disclaimer. I do it the way I do it. You do it the way you want to do it. If you think my way's a little better, try it. But I'm not going to try your way. I've just been doing this too long. The results that I get are more than acceptable for me. That's all I wanted to say. I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you. Welcome back to McCarthy Performance. Today we're going to be talking about setting up clearances on rods and mains, but we're going to do the rods, but this also pertains to the main clearances. Okay, you're going to need a catalog for bearing sizes. This is a very old one, but it covers a lot of the older engines that I use, that I build. This is your rod sizes. This is your housing bore sizes for the rod. This is allowed oil clearances. I won't get into this too much because application dictates oil clearance. Oil also dictates clearances, how much you're going to heat it up, how hot the oil is, how cool the oil is. It all plays a role. We're going to get into bearings. We're going to get into one-overs bearings. We're going to get into different makes of bearings and what you need to watch out for, because not everything is as easy as you think it would be. If you've done this before, you know probably where I'm going with this. First, you got to establish your mic is reading correctly. This is a standard for the mic. This is a 2-inch mic, 2 to 3. And you want to start out, at least make sure your mic is standard. Okay, it's 2-inch. These are precision Weber blocks made by Starrett. This is a 2-inch block. This is a 250 block. These are very, very precise. So we'll check the mic a little bit further open. And we're at 250. Pretty damn close to 250. I mean, not less than a tenth difference there. So we know my mic is reading true. what I do is I set the mic off the journal size. So we know the journal is 2249.3 tenths. Okay, and this is a 400 Pontiac. Not that it matters, but actually the 400 Pontiac and the 455 and the 421, they all take the same rod bearing. The clearances do vary a bit. You got a 400, you've got anywhere from 5 tenths, half a thousandths to 2.7 tenths worth of clearance. On the 421 and the 455, you've got 9 tenths, which is, let's say, a thousandths for sake of argument, and you can acceptable clearances all the way to 3.4. Now, you can go by them clearances and you can build it however you want. This engine has used crank in it. The journals are pretty darn nice on it, or I would have had it ground. You get into grinding cranks, and depending on who's grinding it, you can either end up with something better than what you had, and if it's burnt and it's out of size, I definitely recommend getting it turned. But sometimes if you just polish them and they're within a range, and usually I mic them before I polish them and check the variance on them. If that looks good, we polish them and put them back to use. I don't get too crazy about that. And I have my opinions on clearances, but for a street rod engine that somebody's going to hot rod a bit, and it's not going to be grandma's car, go to church only, put it back away, and maybe go grocery shopping. You can probably get away with a little bit looser or tighter clearances. Probably could get away with some looser clearances too, depending on what the application's for. Obviously, the church-going car isn't going to see the abuse of a racing type engine, but chances are with that car it's going to have a dummy light on it, and if the oil pressure drops down a little bit low, grandma's probably doesn't have an oil pressure gauge, mechanical, so she's not going to know exactly what the oil pressure is when it's hot and ready to rock. But typically, I like to try to be somewhere in the middle. So ideally where I'd like to be at on these bearings is 2. 3 tenths, around there. The housing bores have already been done. I always put my housing bores on the tight side of the spec, which means that it will have the most amount of crush on the bearing. I feel when you rebuild an engine, if you're going to end up with pretty decent clearances in it and everything, it's always a good idea to start with a tight crush. That's going to give your bearing more bearing retention. That's going to allow the bearing to cool more effectively. If you're hunting for clearances and you want to wipe a half a thousandths out of the housing bore, I know guys that have done that. You can do that, but typically even on the race stuff, I always want the housing bores at the tight end of the spec. It holds the bearing. It transfers heat through the back of the bearing, and the bearing won't fret. I've seen where the rods with a bigger housing bore, they can fret. This housing bore in a perfect world you'd think would stay completely round, but at a higher RPM range the housing may distort, and depending on what type of bearing you use, your 12 to 6 is always going to be the tight part of the bearing to read, and your 3 and 9 is going to be the wider part of the bearing. Now that's allowed for oil to ramp into the bearing, but we're not going to get too far into that. Some bearings have more built into them than others. The ones that would have less built into them would probably be the ones you'd want to open up a little bit more for oil clearance. At least I would. Now, what we started out with is Engine Pro engine bearings, which are, I believe, ACL bearings. That bearing was on the big end of the spec. In other words, the biggest end of the spec that is allowed for the 421 455, they're saying acceptable is 3.4. I was at 3.5. So at that point, and I didn't ask for these, that's what they sent me because that's what they had. I don't have no problem with these bearings. I'm just letting you know that bearings don't come the way you think they may come. Everybody's got target sizes. So we'll just leave that at that. I keep a whole shelf of bearings for engines and the race bearings, ACLs. Used to be Kings. We'll talk about Kings and Cleve lights. And then I would check them for size, and then I knew what I had because everybody's bearings are a little different. Okay, now this bearing here this bearing started out at 3.5, and this is a standard bearing for a Pontiac. These are ones. In some applications you can get ones. Big block Chevys, small block Chevys, not too hard. Pontiac bearings are starting to get a little hard. They're not as popular as they were, over 20 years ago. But there's nothing wrong with them. They're a good engine. You just got to know what the limitations of them are with stock blocks, stock rods, and so on. So this is a 1/1000th bearing, so it's going to have 1/1000th less clearance. So if these were at 3.5, and they were, and I got a 1, you would think that I would have had 2.5, and I can live with 2.5 all day long. So, but we're not. Getting back to, I set the mic off the crankshaft, and then I set my dial indicator off my mic. That's the way I do it. I don't use a standard Sonnen setup gauge micrometer. I set everything off my mics. That's the way I've done it, and there's reasons why I do it that way. It just eliminates one less thing, one less variable in the system. This thing could be a C-clamp, and as long as my dial bore gauge is registering off this and it's fairly close, we're taking a measurement off the actual size of the mic, which is reading the actual journal size, and then we're zeroing this off and we're setting it up. Okay, so if we set the gauge in here, stand up the housing bore a little bit. Let's see, we'll use this, sure, why not? Okay, and we're 6 and 12 is always going to be our biggest number. So if you go up in here, we're at 1.5. Now, that's not horrible. 1 3/10. 1.5. It's not horrible, but I like to put them in at 2.5, 2 3/10. That's where I really like them to be. That's kind of acceptable, but your assumption that all the journals are going to be the same, and I make them, and there's a couple that are a couple tenths tighter than this one, then we're going to be down in 1 2/10, and that's, I don't have a problem probably putting them in at 1, but I'd really rather not on a perfectly ground crank. That's a whole different story. So that's where we are. I'm waiting for my Cleve lights. And what I do, and I do this on race engines too, is I'll split this bearing. So I've got 4 standards coming, and I'm going to only use one half of that bearing, and that will probably put me at, well, I'm hoping it'll put me at a little bit more than 2 and a couple tenths, let's say. And I can put that together, and it'll be in the middle of the road. And if there's a couple that are a little tighter, if there's a little bit looser, I'm not going to lose any sleep. I don't want to be at 3.5 thousandths, and then maybe have a couple that sneak in at close to 4. The thing about bearings is, you got to remember, is they're relatively close, but they're not perfect, and they can come with taper in them. They can come variances in sizes, a couple tenths. You're probably not going to pick it up with plastic gauge, and I don't use plastic gauge. And if you don't have nothing, it's better than nothing. But with this gauge, I can control my clearances. I can do it on the fly. If I've got 2 different types of bearings, 3 different types of bearings, I can check them all relatively quick. This is all set up. You're not going to do that with plastic gauge. And you're not going to get down to a frog's hair with a plastic gauge. Now, with this, I can get down to a frog's hair. So that's why I have these, and that's why this one reads in tenths of thousandths of an inch. So right now I'm waiting for my other bearings. I'll check them, but what I'll do is I will put these back in this rod, and remember this rod clearance is at 2 3/10. I'm sorry, 1 3/10, 4/10, around there. It varies. Right down there, it's probably 1 3/10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bearing out, torque the rod back up, put these in, and I'll show you what the difference is. You know, you got to remember that there's in an 8 V8, you got 8 rods, and these things, if you don't keep your track to your clearance, you just say, oh, it's close enough, it's 4 thousandths through, who gives a hell? You're going to find out when you get 8 of them swinging around in there, your oil pressure is going to go down to 0 unless you got a real killer pump in it. And there's places to run oil clearances, and there's places not. And with a stock pump and not tearing the distributor gear off the back of the engine and taking over 20 plus horsepower to run a high volume pump, sometimes clearances are good on race engines, but on street stuff it really isn't very good, because it takes a lot of power to run the pump. It's harder on the distributor gear because that's what's turning the oil pump. You lose a lot of power, and you're using heavyweight oil. So you know you could probably get away with 3.5 on these, but I don't want to do it that way. I'm used to doing it the way I want. So we have the ACL Engine Pro bearing in here, and I'm going to measure it for you and show you just what the difference is. I just want to make sure. Yep. Okay. Sure I got the ones in the right box. I don't want to get these mixed up with my other bearings, but obviously the cleave lights will be marked on the back side of the bearing. There's a lot more I can get into. I'm going to try not to get way off left field. I'm just going to try to keep it simple and understandable for most people that are doing general engine rebuilds on their own, or maybe a few people, but this is, anybody that's been in the business knows this drill quite well. Before I measure this bearing, I'll get into this really quickly. Now this is a race bearing. This would be an H series bearing. Unless you're running a large fillet crank, which is usually an aftermarket crank, unless somebody's ground bigger fillets in it, you're going to have a choice. You're going to run an H bearing, and that's typically what these are called, is an H bearing. And it's going to be a narrowed bearing now. Now what the difference between a narrowed bearing and a regular bearing is simply, this is basically a regular bearing shell, and they chamfer the back, they chamfer the one side of it. And the reason why they do that is so that the larger fillet doesn't catch on the bearing. Now what they're doing now is they're narrowing them. So they're a little bit narrower than these, because they've knocked that off. They've just gone away from this style. I believe ACL still uses this. King may. Please don't send me messages on how you love King. I used King 20 years ago and I liked them. And I've had problems with everybody's bearings, so don't don't send me mail. If you like Kings, great, super. I liked them at one time. Um, at one time, cleave lights were horrible. You could put a small block Chevy, grind the crank within spec, redo the housing boards, get everything as tight and on spec, and the crank as full as you want, and then put 2.5 thousandths on the bearings on the rods. That was to the point where we started grinding them for size. And on older engines, I grind to size, and what that means is I put, when I recondition the rod housing, I put the bearing in, I measure this for size, I zero out my dial bore gauge, I get the actual size reading on the mic, and then I take my mic to my guy that grinds my cranks, and I have him add X amount of clearance to that, or subtract that, let's say. So then that crank is ground. If I want 2 thousandths clearance, it's going to be, the size for it, that bearing, and not worry about it, because some bearings, even the obsolete stuff, I don't have a clue where they're made. I don't think they're made in the United States. So let's get back to these. So the H bearing is either a narrowed bearing or a chamfered bearing. Don't be running these on the street unless you have to run them. These are harder bearings. They don't have much embeddability. There's two schools of thought on that. Some people think, well, if something goes through a foreign particle, the bearing might catch some of it, but it's going to break it off and it'll flush it through. Well, you can do that, but embeddability of a stock bearing is better. And there's tri-metal bearings, and there's bimetal bearings, and there's, we're not going to get into all that. So anyways, we'll get back to measuring this. Sorry about getting out in the weeds there, but so this bearing measures at, let's say it's 4/10. So it's 3 4/10. That's just too big for me. You can probably get away with it, like I said. I don't want phone calls, because I know oil pressure don't mean much at idle. And as long as the oil pressure is building while you're going down the road, you'll probably be all right. But as soon as that oil gets hot and the block warms up, everything warms up, the oil pressure is going to drop a little bit. And unfortunately, everybody thinks, the old 10-pound rule. Well, if you're going to $5,000, 10 pounds, you don't need a whole lot of oil pressure. But it seems like people want to see 80 pounds of oil pressure at idle when it's cold. And, at idle, if you're only idling at 1,000 RPMs, you figure it out. That ain't a hell of a lot of oil pressure. And the earlier cars, they were all depth. So there was a tray under here, and they had scoops on the rods, and whatever it slung up and the rod could catch, that's what the rod had to keep, for oil. So we got a pressurized system. Most V8s are that way. They've come a long ways, but still, the bottom line is you want to control this, and if I can control it, I'll do that, and I do. And getting back to bearings, I can show you just a sample of the bearings that I have. And if I do a lot of small blocks, and I do big blocks, and I do them, I'll keep a couple different makes of bearings on site so I can check them, because when you buy a brand new crank, you don't want the first thing you have to do is send it out and get it ground for clearances. If it's got a good finish on it and everything, you might want to control the clearances. Now on the race stuff and on some of the LS stuff, the clearances on some of the cranks are too tight, and I open them up. So they make plus bearings and they make X bearings, and this happens to be an X, and it's a narrow bearing. So it's an H bearing, which means it's grooved or cut for a large journal crank, or it's a narrow bearing. So this is an H, so that signifies that it's a race type bearing. And then the X means it's going to have more clearance, and then the N means it's a narrowed shell. And like I said, on some of them, they're still chamfering them. for fillet clearance. And this is, it's kind of one of them deals where if you're in this business, I kind of try to keep one of each in stock of the stuff that I use. And normally, what's nice about the aftermarket world is that when you buy a stroker crank for a Pontiac, it uses a big block Chevrolet rod bearing, so I don't have to keep a whole lot of them, and they do that on Fords too. So here's one drawer of just bearings. And then I got another drawer. Oops, that's the wrong drawer. That's my son and stuff. And I got some more bearings in here. And then I got some more bearings back there. So usually when I get a crank in and the rods are within spec, if they're like a aftermarket rod, I'll go for the clearance I want, and I'll use the bearing I want, and then I'll simply order the bearing. Or if I've got them in stock, I'll just use the ones in stock. So I have bearings to pick through. I know some people were saying that they didn't, most of my stuff's out of frame. I get that, but I don't know what's more important, you seeing my smiling face or getting to look at the actual job. I know that it would be nicer if you could see more, but this is what we're thinking about right now. So, and the top is a standard. You can put the bearing pretty much anywhere you want. I do it the opposite of what Cleveland recommends. I just have always done it that way. It makes more sense to me. I'm sure they have a reason. My reason is that the shell that has the most clearance I want under the load side of the rod, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the top. If you got different opinions, that's great. Don't bother wasting your time talking to me about it, because I've done it this way for over 20 years and I keep doing it this way. Now when you split these bearings, you don't have to worry about too much, but when you do a narrowed bearing, you want to make sure, because on a narrowed bearing there's an upper and then there's a lower. This says upper. I've got a couple of them mixed, but that's why you definitely want to make sure that you look at your bearings. Now, these are some bearings that were left over from a previous job, and I split them. So I've got all three uppers right there. But when you open up a box of H bearings, you'll have an upper and a lower, and they're marked, and you better put them on the right way, because if you don't, and check them, because I've had uppers that were marked wrong from the factory, and if they were put together in the engine mismarked, they'd run on the radius of the crank, the fillet radius of the crank. I talked a little bit about fillet radiuses and going to an H bearing, and most aftermarket cranks use a larger fillet. Well, that's mostly only on steel cranks. I want to make sure I clarify that. So you have to run a narrow bearing because they use a larger fillet. It makes the crank stronger. Cast steel cranks, replacement cranks, you don't need an H bearing for them. If you're building it and you think you need the H bearing, you can use them, but most of the time P bearings, bimetal bearings for the power. Yeah, I've got some engines out there that are probably close to over 800 horse with just regular P bearings in it, and they've been together for, oh God, the one I know of has been together for 10 years, and the guy sprays it. It's, it's a pretty good running Ford, but it's just got P bearings in it. We talked about big block and small block Chevrolet rod bearings. Most of the aftermarket cranks, your Oldsmobiles, your Pontiacs, your Fords, most of them guys use a Pontiac main bearing, say on a Pontiac, and they'll use a big block Chevrolet rod, and they'll use a big block Chevrolet rod bearing. and they'll go to a 990 wrist pin, which is Chevrolet, because all that stuff is more common. It's more out there. So, like on a small block Ford, a lot of times, not always, but most of the time, they'll use a small block Chevrolet rod bearing, and they'll use like a 927 wrist pin. And some of the LSs actually, depending on which LS you're talking about, a lot of them rods use the small block Chevrolet bearing, which all the LSs do, but a lot of times they'll go to a 927 wrist pin. So a lot of the Pontiacs and Fords will use Chevrolet bearings, rod bearings. Um, so, whether you decide to use an H bearing is up to you, but in most cases for street stuff, a P bearing is more forgivable. So we're going to check this now. This bearing is standard at the top, and I've got a 1 under the bottom, and I split it, so I've got a half. So getting into this too is splitting bearings. Somebody might say, well, I never heard of that. You can split bearings. You can go from like you can go to a standard. You can go to a 1X. If you wanted extra clearance, or you could go to a 1 plus if you needed less clearance. But you don't put a 10 under bearing, and split it with a 20. You just don't do that. You can move them around a little bit, usually one up, one down. So what I was hoping for on this was to be around 2 3/10. And I've got one side of the engine, one bank's already in the engine, and I know where they all are falling. But I started this video and I didn't have the bearings yet. So the bearings showed up today. We're going to measure it. So this one's at roughly 1 3/10, and 1 2.5 1 3/10. It's or 2 3/10. Let me back up here. I'm having one of them days where I can't get my brain to work my mouth today. But anyways, it's where I want to be. I would have accepted 2.5. And I talked a little bit about grinding them to size. Now, if you run the small housing bore on the rod and you build the rods and you rebuild them to the small end of the spec and you grind the crank to the full end, you would think on, like I say, a small block Chevrolet, you'd be at 1/1000th clearance roughly. Well, there was a time when we used to use cleave lights that you'd be closer to 3. Now, you can run 3 on a small block if you want. And for the race stuff, that's a whole different situation that I mentioned, and I don't really particularly want to get into my clearances, what I use, because I don't want to start a bunch of conversations on the internet. But let's just say they're not what you would expect on an everyday street hot rod engine, or maybe take it out once in a while and run it. If it's only going a quarter of a mile at a time or an eighth mile, things change. Power adders, everything, that all changes. So I'm happy. I'd be happy at 2.5, but I'm happy where I'm at. This is exactly where I want. They're all falling between 2 1/10 to 2 3/10. So I'm fine with that. So that's it on the bearings. I could talk a lot more about bearings, and I don't know if that's anything interest for people, but essentially the clearance is where I want it to be. Now, acceptable range. Well, if you put these bearings in at 3.5, and say you got 3.5 on the crank, and it gets hot, and the oil warms up, or the oil starts to wear out and break down, you're not going to have spectacular oil pressure. And we talked about that last time, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I get a lot of phone calls, and not necessarily pertain to anything that I've built, where people are concerned about oil pressure. And if you don't monitor it, and you don't, if you're throwing large clearances, you're not checking anything, and that goes with the cam tunnel, cam bearings. You can end up with having a big oil leak. Now, oil pressure is resistance. You don't want a whole lot of oil pressure down at idle, because it's hard on stuff. And when the oil warms up, it drops. That's fine, as long as when you stay on the engine, the oil pressure builds through it. I've had engines that didn't make more than 50 pounds of oil pressure that I've ran them to 6,500 all day long and never had a problem with them. So anyways, that's it. I hope somebody got something out of it. This is old news for a lot of guys. Thank you for watching, and talk to you later.